Welcome back, class. Today's explainer is a really big one. We're going to dive enthusiastically into the defining financial event of the 21st century, the Great Recession. As your guide through modern U.S. history, I can tell you right now that understanding this specific economic earthquake is absolutely essential to making sense of the world we're living in today.
But before we really get going, I want you to just consider this question. How did the pursuit of home ownership, literally the classic American dream, lead to a worldwide economic disaster? It's a massive paradox, right? We took something traditionally viewed as the ultimate safe cornerstone of community and wealth building and somehow watched it systematically trigger a global financial collapse.
Okay, here's our syllabus for today. We'll be covering 1. The pre-crisis housing boom, 2. Bubbles and subprime mortgages, 3. The 2008 financial panic, 4. The government rescue efforts, and 5. The rise of populism.
Let's start with Part 1, the pre-crisis housing boom.
Let's set the stage in the early 2000s. Honestly, the American economy looked incredibly strong. Unemployment was low, and housing prices were just rapidly shooting up. Because of this, folks firmly believed that buying a home was pretty much the smartest, safest investment you could make. And the federal government actually heavily encouraged this through things like the mortgage interest tax deduction, which made it way easier to get loans. On top of that, government-supported organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were buying mortgages directly from banks. This was huge because it let banks recover their cash quickly, meaning they could immediately turn around and hand out even more loans to new buyers. It totally supercharged the national mortgage market.
Moving right along to Part 2, bubbles and subprime mortgages. So at the very core of this disaster was the housing bubble. Now, a bubble basically happens when the price of something rises way, way above its actual value, simply because everyone believes prices are going to keep going up forever. People and investors just kept buying houses, completely assuming prices would never decline. And that extreme confidence pushed prices higher and higher, totally detaching them from what everyday families could actually afford to pay. Now, to keep fueling this massive bubble, banks enthusiastically started handing out what we call subprime mortgages. These are loans given to folks with poor credit histories or unstable incomes, people who, historically, just wouldn't qualify for a loan. But lenders completely ignored the immense risks. They just assumed those constantly rising housing prices would magically protect them from any losses. They even lured buyers in with these incredibly low teaser interest rates that were designed to eventually skyrocket, which ended up catching so many borrowers completely off guard. And this is where the local problem goes global. Think of it as a three-step process. Step 1, the risky subprime loan gets approved. Step 2, Wall Street banks take thousands of these mortgages and bundle them together into super complicated investments called mortgage-backed securities. Step 3, they turn around and sell these bundled securities to investors all over the globe. Because our globalized economies were so tightly connected, banks across Europe and Asia were heavily investing in American housing debt. Which brings us to Part 3, the 2008 financial panic. Class, this is the terrifying climax of our history lesson, the moment in 2006 and 2007 when the housing bubble finally burst. The ensuing crash was absolutely devastating. It cemented the Great Recession as literally the worst economic crisis in the United States since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The sheer scale of the financial ruin was historic, and it completely reshaped modern debates over capitalism and government regulation. Let's walk through this timeline of panic. In 2006 and 2007, the music stopped. Housing prices stopped rising and began to fall. Suddenly, millions of people owed way more on their mortgages than their homes were actually worth. Then, the real heart-stopping shockwave hits in September 2008. The massive investment bank Lehman Brothers declares bankruptcy. This completely freezes the global financial system because suddenly banks stopped trusting one another. The government had to jump in to rescue massive companies like the insurance giant AIG and actually take over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. By 2009, the stock market had crashed, businesses were slashing jobs left and right, and millions of Americans were losing their homes to foreclosure. That leads us into Part 4, the government rescue efforts. Faced with total economic collapse, Presidents Bush and Obama had to orchestrate massive, unprecedented government interventions just to stabilize the country. It was a huge, multi-pronged approach. First, Congress passed TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which poured hundreds of billions of dollars into rescuing banks and financial institutions. We also saw major auto industry bailouts for General Motors and Chrysler, just to save millions of related jobs. Then, in 2009, President Obama signed a massive stimulus package to fund infrastructure and unemployment benefits. Finally, the Federal Reserve stepped in, lowering interest rates to near zero to make borrowing cheaper and keep the economy breathing. But, as you might imagine, a really deep resentment started growing as millions realized the massive disparity in these outcomes. While wealthy, powerful banks and large corporations received these massive government bailouts, ordinary Americans were facing the brutal reality of foreclosure, unemployment, and losing their life savings. For a lot of middle-class families, their home was their primary source of wealth, and they literally just watched it vanish. Critics fiercely argued that the government responded way more aggressively to the problems of corporations than to the everyday struggles of homeowners. And that deep frustration brings us to our final section, Part 5, the rise of populism. This profound economic anger directly created a highly polarized and fractured political landscape that we still live in today. As trust in major institutions basically vanished, we saw the dramatic rise of populism. Now, populism is a political movement that claims to represent ordinary people against powerful elites, like wealthy business leaders or establishment politicians. Millions of Americans firmly believed that financial companies caused the crisis but somehow totally avoided serious punishment, and everyday citizens started demanding true accountability. We saw this populist reaction spring up on both sides of the political spectrum. On the right, the Tea Party movement emerged in 2009, arguing the government had grown way too large. They strongly opposed the bank bailouts, exploding government debt, and high taxes. On the left, Occupy Wall Street kicked off in 2011, highly critical of economic inequality and arguing that wealthy corporations had far too much power. Now, these right-wing and left-wing movements completely disagreed on specific political solutions, but both of them shared a very real, deep anger toward the establishment. You probably recognize this slogan from Occupy Wall Street, "We are the 99%. It perfectly captured that populist sentiment. The idea was that the top 1% of economic elites had acquired entirely too much power and wealth in American society, leaving the vast majority, the 99%, to suffer the consequences of Wall Street's risky gambles. Ultimately, this widespread feeling of being ignored by economic globalization and establishment leaders totally reshaped American politics. Impartially speaking, it helped create the exact political environment that paved the way for Donald Trump's 2016 outsider presidential campaign. He appealed directly to voters who felt completely left behind after the Great Recession, actively challenging political elites, the media, international trade agreements, and establishment politicians in both major parties. So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to investigate on your own. Did the Great Recession permanently break our trust in American institutions and the financial elite? Honestly, how much of today's political polarization is really just the lingering shadow of that 2008 crash? It is absolutely a vital question for anyone studying modern history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you all in the next lesson.